last week when we were in Salina, Kansas, you'll remember that the farmer I spoke to had never been to New York. Neither had the housewife I talked to. And in fact, millions of Americans have never been there. To them, New York is as exotic as, say, Venice is to us, and for many of them, just as far away. It's certainly not typical of America. But this week, we're going there just the same.
New York was first colonized by the Dutch. It was named after an English king, James II, when he was Duke of York. The Statue of Liberty came later. It was given to New York by the French. New York must surely be the most spectacular city in the world. It's built on several islands, and it's split into 5 boroughs. But the most famous is Manhattan. That's where you'll find all the famous skyscrapers. And that's where you'll find Times Square, the heart of New York's entertainment world. Most of the familiar skyscrapers are, by American standards, quite old, built at least 25 years ago. But today, plenty of new skyscrapers are going up. The United Nations building started a new trend. It's been called the matchbox style, all glass and aluminium rather than steel and concrete. But my own favorite skyscraper is still one of the old ones, the RCA building. I hope that at least escapes the restless attentions of New York's builders. On every street I found old buildings being knocked down and new and even bigger ones being built. But this isn't just the American enthusiasm for change. New York is badly overcrowded. Too many people living in small, poky flats at very high rents. Times Square, the emotional heart of New York, the place exiled New Yorkers are supposed to dream about. I find it rather disappointing, but it's in and around Times Square that you'll find New York's Theaterland. This is one of the best things about New York. Here were launched Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, and all the famous American musicals. British and French successes are now finding their way onto Broadway. But costs are so high that a show has to be a huge success to survive at all. Park Avenue, still the smartest address in New York, but many of these luxury apartments will soon make way for office blocks and hotels. Fifth Avenue, New York's Main Street. Everything from glittering department stores to St. Patrick's Cathedral. Wall Street, 30 years ago, the symbol of depression. Today, it reflects the prosperity of millions of small and large investors throughout the country. In the famous phrase, New York is a melting pot of all the races and colors in the world. 250,000 Russians, 500,000 Negroes, over 2 million Jews, more than in the whole of Israel. By the thousands, people have come here from every continent, bringing with them their own languages, their own customs, their own way of life. They've even created their own sections of the city, like Chinatown. 3,000 miles from the Pacific, 8,000 miles from China. The lure of New York is so great that a sizable colony of Chinese has grown up here and has brought a splash of color to a rather drab corner of the city. Not far away, Greenwich Village. People who live here claim it's the home of artists and individualists. Well, 30 years ago, I gather it was. Writers and artists who later became famous started in cheap lodgings in the village. But today, much of it seems rather self-conscious and far from cheap, rather like Chelsea in London and the Left Bank in Paris. Still, if you like serious modern jazz, this is where you'll hear some of the best. And this is the home of New York's beatniks. From the beat to the deadbeat. New York may be a wonderful town, as the song says, but just around the corner from the village cafes and the skyscrapers are some ugly scenes. This is Skid Row, the Bowery. Drunks sprawled out on the pavement all day. Welfare organizations try to help them, but they usually finish back on the pavement. Harlem. 500,000 Negroes in New York, most of them here. And most of them live perfectly normal lives, typical New Yorkers. There's some race prejudice even in the North. Negroes run into surreptitious restrictions on where they can live. But there are no legal barriers, and life for the Negro is far freer than in the South. But the slums of Harlem breed crime. New York has a bad crime record. Not all of it comes from the Negroes, but this can be a dangerous place at night time. New Yorkers know that if they walk across Central Park at night, they risk finishing up in the gutter. A much-traveled professor recently took a stroll and was beaten up by a gang of white teenagers. Afterwards, he complained that New York was more dangerous than the jungles of Africa. The home of New York's teenage gangs is on the West Side, the slice of New York which in recent years has been taken over by immigrants from Puerto Rico. This, of course, is the setting of the famous musical West Side Story. I found that the area is a squalid, overcrowded slum. Puerto Rico is an American colony. The people there are as free as any other Americans to live in New York or anywhere else in America. Huge new housing schemes have been launched, and some Puerto Rican families at least have been able to escape into decent, healthy homes. But as fast as old slums are cleared, new waves of immigrants pour in to create new slums. Slums and gangsterism have reached such a pitch that more and more New Yorkers are growing disenchanted with their city. And then there's the dirt of New York. Frankly, nothing surprised me more than to find what a scruffy city it can be. The dustmen never seem able to keep pace with the litter in the streets. Then there's the sheer pace of life in New York. Getting around New York is no easier than in London. There are plenty of taxis, but a ride in one can be pretty frustrating. If you drive your own car, parking can be as difficult as in London and far more expensive. More and more New Yorkers are giving up the struggle and moving out of the city into the suburbs. This is one of the biggest social trends in America, and it's moved clean across the country. 3,000 miles away on the West Coast, I found the same thing, and I asked the mayor of San Francisco, George Christopher, about the march to the suburbs there.
You know, I was in England not too long ago, and we went to a little town called Crawley, where the city fathers had particularly asked that a part of the population be removed to the suburbs in order to alleviate the congestion in London. Here in San Francisco, we have taken a rather different view. Perhaps it's a matter of pride rather than anything else. We hate to lose population. On the other hand, we can't stop the natural forces from being at work. People love to work in the city. They have to work in the city, many of them, but they like to have their families raised in the suburban areas. And if we have rapid transit facilities, I think you'll find more and more people living in the outskirts of the city environs, coming into work and going back home at night. Now, here in San Francisco, we have about 250,000 such people.
Well, do you think this trend into the suburbs is a good thing socially for American life?
It can be if we handle it properly. If there is proper planning in the countrysides, in the suburban areas, so that we will eliminate slums in the future, so we won't have slums in the country instead of slums in the city, I believe it will contribute to a good and wholesome life for our people. I think it's all right. I hate to admit that we're losing people in the cities, but I think, generally speaking, it's good for the youngsters and good for the people, too, the older people, too. But as I said before, it's very necessary that we plan properly. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves ending up with blighted areas in the country, which will be worse than the blighted areas in the city.
Over the past 10 years, 8 out of the 10 biggest cities in America have lost population. New York has lost over 200,000 people, and its suburbs have gained over 1 million. I drove out to one of these suburbs to find out why. Driving inside New York is difficult. Driving out of it, wonderfully easy. Whichever direction you take, the moment you're clear of the city streets, you'll find a fast dual carriageway road running clean out into the country without a traffic light in sight. If you haven't got your own car, and most Americans have, there are fast coaches to take you out. Fine roads like this run out to the suburbs right from the center of the city. This particular one is the New Jersey Turnpike. You have to pay a toll to drive on it, but American motorists don't mind paying for the chance of driving through miles of suburbs at a steady 45 miles an hour. Mind you, driving in the middle of a solid wedge of American cars can be a bit of a strain for someone fresh from the English roads. At least there's nothing much to look at. These roadside hoardings stretch for miles. They're one of the biggest eyesores in America. American advertisers are supposed to be the slickest in the world, but I don't see the object of this. Driving at speed, you've no time to take in such a mass of words, and if you try, you're liable to hit something hard. About 20 miles along the turnpike, we turned off it down a side road to the town of Summit, New Jersey. It's quite an old town, but like so many little towns around London and other English cities, it's been turned into a suburb, the home of thousands of commuters. For many families, the daily routine starts at the railway station. The husband works in New York, the wife drives him to the station, and they say goodbye. Not, I thought, very passionately. But some of the men in Summit stay and work in it, and I went to meet one of them. He was a Mr. Kenyon. His friends call him Tip. He and his wife, Kit, have 3 children and 2 cars, 1 British. His job, well, we'd call him a suburban solicitor. I talked to him in his office and found it much like most English lawyers' offices.
Now, you're a lawyer, Mr. Kenyon. How different is that from being a lawyer in England?
Oh, I think there's a great difference. Although our origins in law are the same, in the United States, you are a lawyer in the state in which you practice. You're admitted to the bar in that state, and as a rule, no place else. There are really 50 bodies of law in the United States, each different, although there are great similarities. And in addition to that, there's the federal practice, which is also quite different. As it happens, the federal practice is very similar to our own New Jersey practice, but there are great differences, and one really only practices within his jurisdiction and is not entitled to practice anyplace else.
Mr. Kenyon, how did you come to move out to Summit?
Well, I was working and living in New York. I was with a Wall Street law firm, and at the time we had 1 child, a small child, and an opportunity came along to come out here, which meant some financial sacrifice initially, and presented such circumstances that were difficult at best. However, it seemed the best thing to do for the children, for the parents. We have more freedom of movement out here. The children have better schools. And when the opportunity came along, I decided to leave New York and come out here, and it has worked out very well.
You mentioned some financial sacrifice. Do you now feel you're doing as well here as you would in New York as a lawyer?
At the end of a 3 or 4 year period, I've been out here since 1956. I think I'm doing as well or better now. Initially, the answer would be no. In New York, there are many lawyers who rise to great heights financially, but there are many more who do not. I think the opportunities are better out here in the long run, and I think I have done better in a short period of time than my contemporaries in New York.
Outside of your work, do you find enough in Summit to occupy your spare time?
Much more than enough. Community life in a town such as Summit is very active, whereas in New York, although there are interesting things to do, community life as such, I would say, is greatly lacking. In a town such as Summit, there are civic activities that are time-consuming and interesting.
You don't miss the New York theaters and the nightclubs?
No, you see, we're really only 45 minutes away by car, barring a traffic jam, and it's easy for us to get in and out. And we still go to the theater a great deal. We go to the museums occasionally, not as often as we should, but we feel that we still live in the New York community and use their advantages to a great deal.
Do most of the men who live in Summit work here too?
I'd say that at least 75% of the men who live in Summit get on that train every morning and go to work in New York and lift themselves onto the train again at night and stagger home after an exhausting day. A great deal due to the fact that they have struggled with the commuting, which is particularly bad in the summer with the heat.
One of the most striking things about Summit is the difference between the center of the town, the shopping streets, the local offices, and the streets of houses running out of it. The center is unexciting. The houses and their streets really charming. Some suburbs in America are as dull and uninteresting as they can be in Britain. But right across the country, I found places as attractive as this. The people living here are, by our standards, middle class. They are certainly not anything grand, and over the country as a whole, they run into millions. One reason why people move out into the suburbs is to get better schools, with light, airy, modern buildings and plenty of room to play. And it's easier to get exercise. There's always a golf course just a few minutes' drive away. And then there's that famous American institution, the Country Club. By American standards, the one in Summit is quite modest, but it's got good tennis courts for the adults and teenagers. And 2 swimming pools, one very shallow, safe for the tiniest child. It was here I found Mrs. Kenyon, keeping an eye on the antics of her children. The Kenyons joined with a number of other families a few years ago to set up this country club themselves. People in American suburbs do try to recreate the community life which has been lost in the big cities. When we got back to the Kenyons' house, I found that Mrs. Kenyon had laid on what we would call a picnic, what the Americans once called a barbecue, and what's now known, quite accurately, as a cookout. A number of their friends came round. I noticed the men providing the color, shorts and gaily colored shirts. Right across America, I found housewives able to arrange this sort of party at almost a moment's notice, and I was intrigued to find out how they do it. I'd seen the outside of the Kenyons' house. Next morning, I went there to find out from Kit something about the inside. First, how many rooms there are.
We have 4 bedrooms upstairs and 2 baths, and downstairs a living room, dining room, study, kitchen, eating area, and porch.
What about down below?
A basement, a room for the washer and dryer and heater, and that's it.
Heater. How do you heat this house?
Forced hot air, central heating.
Central heating. Kit, how easy is it to run a house out here?
Looks to me like a pretty well-equipped kitchen.
Very easy. I have several appliances. This is a sink with a garbage disposal unit. I can put everything in there but paper and cigarettes. Next to it is an automatic dishwasher, which washes everything from pots and pans to silverware and dries them. And over there is an electric stove with 2 ovens and a broiler, and the refrigerator with a deep freeze unit.
The deep freeze underneath.
Deep freeze underneath, which keeps everything from ice cream to meats for 6 months.
Now, Kit, with all these wonderful labor-saving appliances, do you get much spare time?
I should have more spare time. I don't, not with 3 young children. They're either in or out and need constant attention. But when I do get time, I can go to the hospital and do volunteer work or work on various civic activities.
And do you get much time to spend with your husband?
Yes, on the weekends we can pretty much go out when we want to if we have a sitter. He goes out during the weekend meetings, or I go out during the weekend meetings. We spend as much time as we want to out.
Well, do you prefer living in Summit, or would you rather go back to New York?
Oh, no, I prefer Summit.
Why?
It's much easier, it's a lot more spacious, and with the children, they can play out when they please or run around.
Is it difficult bringing up children around here, or easier, do you think?
Easier. They're on their own. As far as play goes, when we were in the city, you had to go out with them every minute, watch them. This way they can play in the yard and I can be inside doing something else.
How do you find shopping out here?
Shopping is easy. We have our local shops, which are about a mile away, which have pretty much everything, food, clothing. And then they have built these big shopping areas, which hold several thousand cars. They have everything from food to clothing to shoes to recreation like bowling, well, just everything.
How often do you have to go down there?
Well, I go uptown, which is a mile away for food, once a week.
And with a deep freeze?
With a deep freeze, I could go every 2 weeks. I go once a week, but you could go every 2 weeks.
To meet the demands of this growing army of suburban housewives, more and more of America's big chains of stores are opening branches in the suburbs. Saks Fifth Avenue is one of the most famous of all, and I found one of the more expensive. One thing which makes it possible for big New York stores to have suburban branches is that so many Americans have at least one car, if not 2, and can drive to these stores from several miles around. Shopping centres also have what are called discount houses, shops which sell practically everything on a serve-yourself basis. Human labour is one of the most expensive commodities in America. By cutting down on it, the discount houses can cut prices by 20%. The battle among the large stores for the custom of the housewife with her own car is spreading right across America. I went into one of them and talked to the manager, Mr. Dedecker. His store had all the most modern setting devices, including controlled background music. I began by asking Mr. Dedecker what effect the music had on sales.
This has a tremendous effect on our sales, both from the buying public and from our salespeople. We find that it's very invigorating for our salespeople and our buying customers to hear the background music not knowing it's actually there. They move faster, they produce better.
And your sales go up?
Oh yes, definitely.
Now in this store, say you've sold something like one of those refrigerators, do you take any further interest in it?
We take a complete interest in the welfare of our customers' merchandise. We give our customers, as an example, in the washers, refrigerators, mechanical merchandise, a full year's guarantee on service and parts. Then after that full year is lapsed, we keep parts in stock on that particular mechanical merchandise for up to 10 years, so that anywhere in the United States and our Latin American and Canadian stores, they can furnish our customers those parts and the service to take care of that merchandise.
Is this servicing tending to take the place of price as the big factor in competition between stores now?
This is becoming a big factor, although price still weighs heavy as far as the customer's selection. service is becoming more and more popular and more of a factor in the purchase of this mechanical merchandise, yes.
How much of your trade is on credit and how much in cash?
We do about 47% of our business on credit, about 53% of the balance in cash. In fact, we can do so many things in America today on credit. Show you what I have here. We have a credit card to fly by airplane. You can go into any Sears store throughout the United States and buy merchandise. You can use this one to go into any hotel. This one for lodging, food, what have you. This particular one will allow you to phone long distance or local calls anywhere. So you can go anywhere in the United States practically on credit today. Credit is a big factor in our business, in our economy in the United States.
And is it growing?
It's growing by leaps and bounds. In the last few years, credit has taken over many of the phases of carrying cash. You just don't have to carry cash in America anymore.
Well, even if you don't have to carry it, you've still got to have it. But I suppose that for sheer ease of living, it's hard to beat the pattern of life in these booming American suburbs. You can satisfy practically any material desire by just pressing a switch or taking a short drive in a car. But as I said last week, some Americans are unhappy about this. They're afraid prosperity is making America soft, that the country is losing its old resilience, and they're particularly worried about this new, easy suburban life. Now, the people I met in Summit were very decent, but to me they seemed to take surprisingly little interest in anything outside their homes and their town, less, for instance, than the people in the supposedly isolationist Middle West. And this parish pump thinking seems to be fairly general in the suburbs, and it's a problem you frequently hear discussed in America. But of course, an even greater problem for Americans is the one we're going to deal with next week, the color problem in the South. Good night.